for framing this and for bringing me into this space in the first place. I have many people to thank, so thank you to MoMA and the CMAC program, to Pradnya, for her many conversations with me by Skype to kind of develop this, to Linnea for all the arrangements, and in particular to Valentine Gunasekara and his family, Suren, his son, who is somewhere in the audience, for allowing me to uncover his work in this way. So, born in Colombo, Ceylon in 1931, to a close-knit Catholic middle-class family, Valentine Gunasekara's career tracks the trials of a generation caught between global influences and regional politics. So we are kind of moving to another side of the brain almost in this presentation, because we're looking at social history. Trained at the Architectural Association School in London, Gunasekara, like many contemporaries, including Geoffrey Bawa and Minette de Silva, were educated in tropical modernist approaches conceived for Britain's former colonies. But he practiced during the height of Cold War tensions in Asia, when socialized policies of import substitution nurtured general antipathy towards Western values, and architects sought alternative solutions to building design. Whereas his celebrated contemporaries would indigenize their architecture using local vernacular-derived forms and materials, Gunasekara would idealize modernism and its seemingly abstract aesthetics. His faith in its ability to overturn Lanka's many social divisions was premature. In the eyes of many who measured him against Geoffrey Bawa, he failed to build a career in architecture. But this failure has to do with the post-colonial reception of modernism rather than the ability of the architect. Why was Gunasekara's modernism unpalatable to his contemporaries? When I first met Gunasekara in 2005 in Bedford, Massachusetts, and examined his fading drawings and photographs, he was considered an anomaly. This was an era when regionalist architecture, advocated by the Aga Khan program, was building the careers of many South Asian architects, most famously Sri Lanka's Geoffrey Bawa. The preferred aesthetic was one which built seamlessly on indigenous vernacular forms and elements, cleverly combined with Southern European sensibilities in the case of Bawa. Modernism seemed culturally alien, poorly adapted to the local climate, and incapable of nurturing the complex social relationships of Asian families. More critically, for Sri Lanka, it called for steel-reinforced concrete construction, alien to the village vernacular. Culturally sympathetic, climate-sensitive forms and locally available materials placed less strain on the local building industry. In order to understand Lankan antipathy towards modernism, we need to look closely at mid-20th century Ceylon. The country had emerged as an independent nation after 4 centuries of European colonial rule in 1948, and it embarked on a project of systemic decolonization. In this, it was partly aided by its most recent colonial rulers, the British. As they adapted the political system for local representation, government architects designed colonial institutions along Indic lines. Influenced by the arts and crafts movement prevalent in India, these styles, made famous by Latyans and Baker in New Delhi, elevated aesthetic elements identified by colonial archaeology as public signs. This superficial form of indigenization masked the underlying imperial authority, which was challenged violently post-war. In Sri Lanka, it manifested in the Buddhist aesthetic, decorative elements drawn from palatial and religious monuments that found their way into the public architecture of the newly independent nation-state. Such ethnocultural embellishments were anathema to Gunasekara and to many of his contemporaries in the first generation of architects trained in Britain, including de Silva and Bawa. They, like Gunasekara, trained at the Architectural Association in London during the 1950s, where the tropical program under Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew was training a generation of experts in a climate-sensitive approach. The style bridged the gap between Europe and Asia, building on colonial innovations in building science, but adhering rigidly to the acultural basis of the modernist aesthetic. The early architecture of both Bava and De Silva, who commenced professional practice during the 1950s, emulated this style. On his return from the AA, Gunasekara worked alongside Geoffrey Bava at Edwards Reed and Beck, ER&B, under James Nilgiria, whose Buddhist style aesthetic they both abhorred. So this is an example of the early modernist style by Minette De Silva here. The 1950s was a period of political turbulence for Ceylon. Anti-colonial sentiment that had accompanied independence evolved into rejection of the capitalist West. A socialist-leaning populist political opposition seized power by advocating for the language and culture of the majority Sinhalese. Political alliances were reformed under the Cold War constellations that dominated Asia, Russia, China, and to a lesser extent, the nations of the Eastern European bloc. Surplus cement consignments that came with foreign-funded reservoir projects initiated a different strain of modernism. The newly established State Engineering Corporation experimented with diverse prefabricated and in-situ reinforced concrete technologies at the 1965 Industrial Exhibition in Colombo. Their efforts were complemented by the many international pavilions by aid-giving countries, such as East Germany, West Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Israel, China, India, Pakistan, and the United States. The young Valentine Gunasekara and the engineer Jayati Veerakon designed a tropical modernist pavilion for Samuel & Sons, a private contracting and supplying company, who were displaying their machinery at the exhibition. The partnership would flourish over the next 20 years. The pavilion's floors were of reinforced concrete and were connected by a steel spiral staircase. It had masonry walls and a corrugated asbestos roof, overlaid with half-round roof tiles. Each of the floors exhibited a new range of machinery, painted in glossy colors, parts of which were inserted into cavities cut into the pavilion walls. No air conditioning was used, with the interior maintaining a humidity level of about 50%. Photographs of visitors to the industrial exhibition capture the vibrancy of Lankan modernity during this transitory period. Sari-clad women in bouffant hairstyles and high-heeled shoes convey how the roaring 60s was creeping into this otherwise insulated polity. Writing on this period, I identified an incipient cosmopolitanism after the vernacular immigrant sensibilities in metropolitan centers in Europe and America, which has been discussed by the post-colonial theorist Homi Bhabha. Bhabha's work focused on migrant culture rather than the culture of South Asia in particular. But here I saw it as producing a kind of cosmopolitanism that was very much a moment in time. In Sri Lanka, the term seemed applicable to an emergent social strata created by university education and professionalization, who were populating industrial suburbs at the edges of the former colonial city. The post-war pathways for social mobility through suburban modular housing provision appeared as a global phenomenon linked with rising American influence. Vernacular sensibilities, anti-colonial sentiments, and cosmopolitan aspirations combined to enable new social agendas and architectural experiments. Gunasekara's first house, designed while still a student at the AA, followed these trends. And you can kind of sense the 60s sensibility in that. As Gunasekara recalled, they were ready for change, looking for change. Most of them were professionals, middle-aged, and very few of them were landowners or gentlemen and ladies at large. So it was a different clientele and clientele demands. It was the final rejection of the crinoline, the formality of British family life. The cosmopolitanism that defined this group was a complex hybrid of parochial values and worldly desires. Gunasekara, eager for symbolic and expressive forms that might capture this post-independent spirit, turned from environmentally inappropriate steel and glass architecture to concrete technologies. He was particularly enamored of Eero Saarinen. He applied for and was awarded a J.D. Rockefeller III travel grant to the United States in 1965. Of his experience, he recalled, "I was influenced by the search for totally new spaces. The formation of the mind that created the catenary curve and the Jefferson Memorial Arch was to me stunning. How did this man, who was surrounded by colonialism and all these formal monuments, come up with this wonderful freedom of thinking of a memorial as a form? And how did he get to the enormous scale of that bravery?" It was a similar experience with the TWA terminal, which set me rethinking all forms, realizing that we could now explore shapes and experiences that had not occurred before. Gunasekara embarked on a journey across America. Although impressed with Taliesin, the Cranbrook Academy, and Barragan's work in Mexico, it was California modernism that proved revelatory. His visit was timely. Louis Kahn was beginning his project in Dhaka, Bangladesh, and Charles and Ray Eames were working on an exhibition on Jawaharlal Nehru. Craig Elwood was fresh from the case study Houses project. But it was Richard Neutra's architecture that captivated Gunasekara, as it seemingly responded to a laid-back lifestyle, mild climate, and sunny skies equivalent to those of his homeland. This was an approach that could easily be adapted, he thought. Following 6 months in Saarinen's former office designing prefabricated systems under Kevin Roach, Gunasekara returned to Lanka, bursting with new ideas. Upon his return, tensions with Jeffrey Bawa prompted an early departure from ER&B to set up office at Milagiriya Avenue. It was a difficult time for the industry. Land reform, import substitution, and nationalization of major industry had insulated Lanka, increasing anti-Western sentiment. Spiraling petroleum prices after the 1973 OPEC crisis enforced import substitution. This was an environment better suited to the craft-based traditions advocated by Bawa and De Silva. They masked the free plan and reinforced concrete frame with the culturally resonant aesthetic features of tiled roofs, timber colonnades, and deep shaded verandas, resuming spatial traditions displaced by the 20th century colonial bungalow. This everyday vernacular architecture was more familiar to village masons, and the construction practice more forgiving of alteration during the building process. Renouncing the formalism learned at the AA, both Bawa and De Silva adopted a sympathetic bricolage. So here's an example of a pretty famous elite kind of house of the colonial period, and you can see Bawa's design on the right, which shows you how he is deriving the aesthetic from these sensibilities. Gunasekara maintained his fealty to modernism. He built scale models and produced detailed working drawings annotated in Sinhala so that the local masons could understand them. The little boy on the left is Suren, who's in the back of the room. He documented every phase of the construction process. Here you can see the writing in Sinhalese as instructions to the mason. His rigor was supported by his design partners, architect Christopher De Seram and engineer Jayati Veerakorn, who worked closely with him on key projects. They pierced the concrete formalism of the modernist box with internal courtyards and concrete pergolas, inspired by but not evidently derivative of indigenous architecture. Among Gunasekara's clients were middle-class, professional, university-educated women who, along with his wife Rani and 8 children, flattened the entrenched hierarchy of the domestic interior. Among the first houses Gunasekara built in Colombo was one for his brother, VGH, in Janaki Lane, a house with only one door due to the cost of timber work, and the more elaborate Ilangakon house. Here he designed in section, enveloping the house in a high concrete wall against the urban insecurities of the period, and freeing up the internal volumes to open up the box. The rooms in the house were differentiated by changes in level, courtyards, and floor textures rather than by walls. One example in particular illustrates his ongoing struggle with pitched roofed forms. The Elapatha house, in a rubber plantation in Ratnapura, seemingly grows out of the granite retaining walls that protect the estate's embankments, but conceals pitched roof pavilions behind them. The struggle with roof forms persists in his religious buildings. Gunasekara was a staunch Roman Catholic, a predominantly coastal minority in Sri Lanka, and his designs of small chapel buildings in particular exemplified his faith. Many of them appear derivative of the European modernism they draw on, and have earned him the reputation of an expressionist. But there is a kind of slippage between the known and remembered forms and the hybrid processes they incorporate. Above all, there are innovations in dialogic congregation introduced at the Second Vatican Council in 1965. The Jesuit chapel in Colombo appears to have inspirations from Le Corbusier and from North Africa, but it was the coastal location that motivated its billowing roof form. Two other small chapels are equally expressive. The rural St. Martin de Porres Church, designed to welcome parishioners from all sides, you can see the openness of it, is reminiscent of Our Lady of Fatima in Brasilia. But it is the chapel for the Sisters of Providence at Tevata that achieves the sense of congregation anticipated by Vatican II. The Nautilus plan, the conversation pit, and the abstract altar design are radical departures from colonial and indigenous traditions. The pitched roof, albeit skylight at its apex, takes on the forms and materials of the surrounding village houses so it might blend in. Gunasekara's secular and commercial buildings are clever translations of the masterpieces he saw in America. The St. Anthony's Montessori playfully tests the columns of Felix Candela, while the Plywood Corporation building adopts a familiar template for urban commercial buildings. These overtly modernist programs were rejected wholesale, but in 1982, Gunasekara entered a competition for the Sri Lanka Institute of Architects with a daring exploration of deconstruction. He was awarded second prize. The favorite was a conservative structure with a pitched roof. A final example of Gunasekara's work raises another dimension of Lankan society underlying his approach. Gunasekara came from the Salagama, or cinnamon peeler caste, a marginal coastal group who had risen in caste status following the colonization of the maritime provinces. They had a working relationship with the Hunu, or lime burner caste, who prepared cement from burning coral for the colonial building trade. Two village masons who worked closely with Gunasekara, Sirisoma and Siripala, claimed their caste affiliation as a measure of their loyalty to him. This close association enabled a bold experiment, the Tangol Bay Hotel. Built at a time when hotels were colonial urban phenomena and rural sites were barely developed, the hotel was a unique test case for the modernist aesthetic. Each stage of the construction was documented in detail. The nautical theme design had curvilinear ramps and circular windows, while the building perched on a rocky promontory like an ocean liner about to set sail. The rooms, each with its private terrace, cascade down to the beach. But most importantly, despite its exclusive program, its unfenced boundaries and accessibility endeared the hotel to the local community. This building encapsulates the balance of social accessibility with cultural resonance as unresolved by modernism, which Gunasekara discovered to his cost. The celebrated hotels of his contemporaries, although segregated behind high boundary walls, were aesthetically indigenized. Gunasekara was a casualty of a canny regional rebuttal to globalization, using archaic, authentic, and vernacular aesthetics. Unable to build a practice in Sri Lanka, he worked briefly overseas in Nigeria and in St. Louis before emigrating to the US in 1987. He taught at the Wentworth Institute of Technology in Massachusetts and retired to Sacramento, California. He passed away peacefully at sunset on September 3rd, 2017. Thank you.